And what a weekend that he's joining us here, because we have a lot of updates for you. First of all, on the impeachment inquiry into the president, we want to start with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He did not meet yesterday's subpoena deadline from 3 separate House committees to hand over documents related to Ukraine. On top of that, they've issued a new subpoena, this for the White House to hand over their documents.
Meantime, there could be a second whistleblower getting ready to file a separate formal complaint about the president. The New York Times reporting that another intelligence official with even more direct knowledge of the phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's president has concerns that Trump may have committed some misdeeds while speaking with that leader.
And finally, the Washington Post reporting this morning that the president's phone calls with foreign leaders are, quote, an anxiety-ridden set of events for his staff, who are worried that he'll make promises he shouldn't keep. CNN's Kristen Holmes with us now from Washington. Kristen, good to see you. What are we hearing from the White House this morning regarding these subpoenas?
Good morning, Christy and Boris. Well, I thought that was never going to end. There is so much news coming out of the White House. In terms of what we're hearing right now, all we've seen is a statement from the press secretary that essentially says that these subpoenas have changed nothing, and of course, attacking Democrats. But it should be noted here that even before these formal subpoenas were issued, the White House was contemplating sending a letter to Speaker Pelosi that essentially said that they didn't have to turn over any documents to this investigation because it wasn't a formal investigation, citing the fact that there hadn't been a formal House vote. So right now, big question as to whether or not they'll comply. But what this subpoena shows is that this investigation is really ramping up here. It came after those 3 committees that are doing this impeachment investigation sent a letter to Vice President Pence, essentially asking him for more documents. Now, this is all around that trip to Poland last month when Vice President Pence stepped in for the president and met with the Ukrainian president. This letter says that they are looking for any kind of indication they're interested in any role that the vice president might have played in conveying this message or the president's views to the Ukraine. But with all of this going on, President Trump, he is doubling down. He is blaming Democrats and saying this is purely political.
And you know better than anybody, for the last 3 years, Democrat lawmakers, they're deep state cronies, the fake news media, they've been colluding in their effort to overturn the presidential election. 63 million people voted, and to nullify the votes of the American people. And many African American people voted for Trump.
Now, we know that this is a talking point of Republicans, that they will say that Democrats have been obsessed with this since 2016. But last night, we heard from Speaker Pelosi, who says that this is not political. Take a listen.
Some people say, why are you doing this? He's not worth it to divide the country this way. I said, well, he may not be, but our Constitution is worth it. Our democracy is worth it.
So, Christy and Boris, there you have it. 2 sides clearly not backing down, and it is clear right now that we are in for a long road ahead of us.
Yeah, Kristen. Now, can we say that the White House is effectively taunting the House Speaker by putting out this letter saying that it won't provide any documents unless she brings us to a full vote in the House? Are they just daring her to bring it on?
Absolutely. They want this vote. Right now, the administration is saying behind closed doors that they actually don't think that Democrats have the vote to launch this impeachment investigation. Now, Democrats have publicly, we've heard from many of them, saying that they do have the numbers there. But again, administration saying we don't have to comply. So we dare you to actually launch this vote. And we'll see there. And keep this in mind. We are coming into an election year. Part of what they want here, they want those Democrats in those swing districts to be on the record saying one way or the other, because that is going to impact that 2018 election.
All right, Kristen Holmes, thank you so much for the time this morning.
Listen, right now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Greece. We have some live pictures showing you here. This is hours after he defied that House subpoena to produce Ukraine documents. Now, this is the 3rd time the secretaries failed to meet deadlines to produce Ukraine-related documents. And earlier this week, he accused lawmakers of intimidating and bullying State Department officials. Political writer for Spectator USA contributor Kelly Jane Torrance. So, Kelly, I want to ask you regarding Secretary Pompeo. I mean, this is a man who served in the House for 6 years. He knows and understands the role of congressional oversight. What are committees prepared to do to try to obtain these documents? And why do you think he's not cooperating?
Yeah, good morning, Christy. He certainly does know, and if he were in Congress and it were a Democratic president, he would be speaking a very different tune. So it's very interesting to see what people do when they're in power as opposed to when they're part of the oversight, which of course is one of Congress's roles. I do think that he's going to have to do something eventually. He's going to have to hand over these documents, but he's certainly stalling for time, and I think that is one of the strategies. Nancy Pelosi would like to get the impeachment inquiry finished and over before the end of the year. She doesn't want to drag it out into 2020, the election year. And so I think part of the Republican strategy is let's drag this out, let's make it difficult for Democrats to get what they want.
All right, and by the way, we're going to monitor that press conference that we see Secretary Pompeo participating in right now. If he says anything, we'll certainly bring that to you. But Kelly, I do want to talk to you as well about this take on the New York Times report that a second intelligence official is debating whether he or she should file a formal whistleblower complaint. What do we know about this person and what he or she may be able to add to the conversation that's already being had with this first whistleblower?
Well, one of the things we know, and of course we don't know too much, that's one of the reasons that you use the whistleblower laws, is that you don't want to be publicly identified. But one of the things we do know is that this person actually has direct knowledge, apparently, of the discussions that President Trump had with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. That, of course, is one of the things Republicans have been able to hit the first whistleblower on. That whistleblower, and we know it's a man, we don't know much beyond that, and that he's a CIA agent, but we do know that he was relying on things that officials told him. He was not on the call himself. He was relying on secondhand information, and of course Republicans were hitting this as mere hearsay. Well, this new whistleblower apparently has direct knowledge, so that would make those Republican arguments basically moot. The fact, though, that the transcript of the call has already been released, I'm not sure what more this whistleblower can offer. Of course, I don't know what else this person knows, but we have the call, and we have President Trump now in public asking Chinese President Xi Jinping to investigate Joe Biden. So this president is not worried about telling in public that he wants his political rivals investigated. It was, to me, kind of a little bit of a surprise that he's facing an impeachment inquiry over his calls with the Ukrainian president, and here he is in public asking the Chinese president to do the same thing. But that's Donald Trump, and he thinks he can get away with it. It's certainly, we're going to find out, it's a political issue, impeachment, obviously not a legal question of specifically did he break the law, but impeachment has always been a political thing, and it's up for Congress to decide whether he committed those high crimes and misdemeanors that are mentioned in the Constitution.
Right, and again, let's remember the White House is issuing a letter Monday to urge the impeachment vote there. Kelly Jane Torrance, always good to have you here. Thank you, ma'am.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Turns out that it was more than just heart stents. Senator Bernie Sanders is promising he will return to the campaign trail despite doctors confirming that he did in fact have a heart attack earlier this week. Joining us now to discuss is Dr. Stephen Nissen. He's a cardiologist with the Cleveland Clinic. Doctor, first we have to ask, what does a myocardial infarction mean, and how does it relate to what Senator Sanders is dealing with now?
Well, he had a heart attack. It does sound like it was a limited heart attack, meaning that there wasn't a lot of damage to the heart muscle, but a heart attack simply when there's a blockage in the coronary that deprives part of the heart muscle of blood flow, and there's some damage to the heart. In his case, it sounds like it was not a lot of damage, which is good.
Okay, so I know that he says he's going to rest a while before he gets back on the campaign trail. What, if you were his doctor, how would you advise him at this stage?
Well, first of all, the whole purpose of modern medicine is to get people back to work quickly. And we do this all the time. We often tell people to take a little bit of time off and maybe take it easy for a few days. But frankly, I've had people that have gone back to work the next day after they get out of the hospital, maybe not working 16 hours a day. But there's no reason why he can't fairly quickly, get back to what he's doing. We know something about his disease. We know it was relatively limited. We know he got treatment very early, and the right treatment is to reopen the artery. And so in the modern era, a heart attack, is something you recover from fairly quickly.
Despite that, optimistic outlook, we have to keep in mind Bernie Sanders, the senator, is in the grind of the campaign, and he's doing more than 16-hour days consecutively. What does recovery look like when you're facing that kind of grueling schedule and grueling travel, too?
Well, I mean, I think it would be prudent for him maybe not to work quite as hard as he has. But look, this is an energetic guy. I mean, you watch him on the campaign trail, and I don't think his doctors, even if I were his doctor, I don't think I'd probably be able to hold him back very much. Having said that, he's very unlikely to do himself any damage if he just gets back to work. Frankly, the earlier people get back to work, often the better they do. We don't want people sitting around becoming a couch potato after a heart attack. So, I don't think this is a big deal for him to get back to work pretty quickly.
And you don't think that there's no indication that he would be vulnerable to something happening again?
Well, it turns out we know something about his disease, and I know this from the media, not from his physicians, that he had one vessel that was blocked. It was treated very quickly. He got 2 stents. The vessel's open. That means he's not at a high risk of having another event. And so I do think the prognosis for, long term is very good. And, his age is not a big impediment. We see people a lot older than this that have heart attacks, and we get them out of the hospital relatively quickly, and we get them back to whatever it is they were doing.
All right, Dr. Stephen Nissen, so appreciate your expertise. Thank you for sharing your perspective with us today.
Thanks
It's much.
Meantime, Joe Biden fires back after the
20 minutes past the hour, and Joe Biden is launching this renewed attack on President Trump, calling him unhinged, accusing him of trying to choose his opponent in the 2020 race.
Yeah, Biden trying to take advantage of this controversy circling President Trump. Take a look at this new ad just released by the Biden campaign. Correspondent Jessica Dean has been following this story. What do you think of this ad, Jessica?
Well, good morning to you both. This ad is actually being released in response to a Trump campaign ad that is full of false claims against Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. And the Biden ad is really targeted at the message that we continue to hear from the Biden campaign, which is if Donald Trump is going after Joe Biden this hard, if he is spreading these false lies, and if he's calling foreign leaders for dirt on Joe Biden, that Joe Biden is the most electable. He's the one that Donald Trump is the most afraid to go up against in 2020. And this ad that's being released in these early states comes after a week where we heard the strongest rebuke of President Trump yet from Joe Biden. I was with him in Reno, Nevada earlier this week when he was talking to a group there. He stood in front of flags. He looked very presidential, and he really took the case against Donald Trump and continued to call him unhinged and corrupt and that he's lying. And then yesterday in Los Angeles, he spoke to reporters after a union event there. Take a listen.
He calls the impeachment proceeding a coup. A coup. He talks about how we should handle whistleblowers. He talks about there will be a civil war. This is the guy that's unhinged. He is unhinged. I worry about what he's going to do, not about me or my family. I worried about what he'll do in the next year in the presidency as this thing continues to rot on his watch. The fact of the matter is, you wonder what this guy's going to do. Have you ever seen, a rhetorical question, a president ever so unhinged as this guy is? That's what worries me. Let the House focus on what they're focusing on in the Senate, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to beat him on the merits.
And again, in that room in Los Angeles yesterday, typically you have the candidates come in, the reporters will start to ask questions. Vice President Biden came in and he had something to say. He launched right into that. He knew exactly the message he wanted to get across to everyone, Boris and Christy. And he really went back and he said, I'm very concerned about what happens in the next year of the presidency. He says he's concerned that President Trump is going to do something, and I'm quoting here, really, really stupid as it pertains to our international interests. So more to come on this. Boris and Christy.
All right, Jessica Dean, thank you so much.
Still to come, the controversial act of...
What do you think? We know that Branjean, by the way, was on Dr. Phil yesterday and said that he thought the cameras were off of him when he asked for that hug. His mother, who's called for a renewed focus on police training, said she was shocked by what he did. And there's a religious group that filed a complaint against the judge in the case after she gave Geiger a Bible in the courtroom and hugged her. We're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to ask you why you think this hug it's upset people.
Well, it's certainly unusual. I mean, I can't count the number of times I've been in a courtroom when juries come back with a verdict, the judge is going to sentence a defendant, the judge allows the victim's family to testify for sentencing purposes. Sometimes you'll hear from the defendant. It tends to be a cold, methodical process. Somebody will get up and read a statement, well, this is how this crime has impacted my family. The victim will say, well, maybe things would be different. I wish, I could have my brother back, my wife back, whatever the case may be. What we saw in this courtroom was pure, raw human emotion, and that is frankly missing from courtrooms too much, in my opinion. That we do a great job of processing people through the system, but a very poor job of trying to rebuild lives, of trying to put redemption back into a victim's family. So if he was motivated at that moment to do something out of the ordinary, I think it's great that he did it. I understand that it's unusual, I can see the controversy, but that is exactly the type of thing that's missing in courtrooms, that healing, the starting of the process. Send her to prison, that's fine, that's where she's going, but how is that going to help him or his family? It's really not. So I applaud him for doing it. I know it was unusual, and I applaud the judge for allowing him to do it, even though it was out of the ordinary.
Yeah, no doubt. And speaking of the judge, here's the complaint that we were talking about, or part of the complaint that we were talking about, that says, we too believe our criminal justice system needs more compassion in judges and prosecutors, but here, compassion crossed the line into coercion, and there can be few relationships more coercive than a sentencing judge in a criminal trial and a citizen accused and convicted of a crime. Is it a violation under the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct here?
Not that I'm aware of, no. A judge is not supposed to hand anything to a defendant in that situation. I know it wasn't planned. I guess the judge, who appeared to be emotional as well, as we were listening to the brother's testimony, just felt compelled to do this. And it wasn't like the judge interrupted the proceedings and said, now let's all pray together. I don't think she brought religion into the courtroom. It was a simple act of what the judge thought was kindness by giving her a Bible and wishing her well.
All right. There's another trial underway right now that we need to talk about. This is a case of a former police officer charged with murder for killing an unarmed black man, I think for about 5 hours yesterday. But I wanted to ask you about whether this was excessive force. I mean, the 911 call stated that people were calling because they saw an erratic man who had no clothes on, knocking on doors, running around. He was running toward the officer. Should the officer have done something other than shoot him? Well,
that's what the jury's trying to determine. This officer apparently had no prior disciplinary issues like this. He had never been accused of excessive force. He's I think 6-7-year veteran of seven-year veteran of DeKalb County Police Department. He arrives on the scene having heard that somebody there is acting erratically. He sees the person who appears to be acting erratically. Apparently there were some mental health issues. But it's also clear that the person is not armed. And so the question for the jury is, was it appropriate, was it reasonable for the officer to pull his firearm and shoot this individual who was clearly not armed when he had his baton, when he had other ways perhaps to deal with the situation? The defense is saying, look, it may be so in hindsight, but he had 6 to 7 seconds to make that decision. And you got to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, as we know, it is very difficult to convict police officers in cases of excessive force. But this is a close case. Now, the officer did not testify. That surprised me. He didn't speak to the jury and say, this is what I was thinking at the time, this is why I did what I did. And that may come back to hurt him at the end of the day because the jury never heard his side of the story from him directly.
All right. I want to talk about, too, this gang-related murder case in Chicago. This is stomach-turning. Corey Morgan and DeWright Doty were found guilty of first-degree murder for planning the killing of 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee, that little boy right there. This murder was in retaliation for the killing of Morgan's brother, one of the suspect's brothers. The two suspected that the gang that Tyshawn's father belonged to was behind the killing. So here's what is part of so disturbing. It's so disturbing. There are recordings of Boone Doty, who pulled the trigger here, allegedly confessing. He boasted about the killing. He's described as laughing as he shot him. He wrote a rap song about it. When he was asked if he ever thinks he shouldn't have done it, Boone Doty responds, "No, I don't."
Some material way. I mean, there have been people, even here in Georgia, who have been executed who never pulled the trigger, never actually killed anyone, but were involved in the planning, were involved in allowing it to go forward. And so first degree murder, although people may think, well, it's got to be more serious if you're the actual person who pulls the trigger, if you're the gunman. Not necessarily, not under the law. And I will tell you, Illinois state cases, there's no death penalty anymore there. If that case were tried here, it almost certainly would have been a death penalty
For
case.
both of them?
I think so, yeah.
Wow. All right. Paige Pate, we appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you. Always good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Absolutely. Boris?
President Trump calling on China to investigate Joe Biden. As we learned, he reportedly promised China's president that he would stay quiet on Hong Kong protests while trade talks. Trump promised Chinese President Xi Jinping that the U.S. would stay silent on pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong as their trade talks continued. Yesterday, President Trump said all his conversations with foreign leaders are appropriate, repeating that line. It came just hours after calling on China to investigate Joe Biden.
Yeah, and Senator Marco Rubio is responding now, saying he doesn't believe the president's request was genuine.
Do you think it's okay for President Trump to ask China to launch an investigation of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden?
I don't know if that's a real request or him just needling the press, knowing that you guys were going to get outraged by it. He's pretty good at getting everybody fired up, and he's been doing that for a while, and the media responded right on task.
But you're one of the loudest critics of China and its human rights abuses. I mean, is it okay for him to ask to say that?
I don't think it's a real request. I think he did it to gig you guys. I think he did it to provoke you to ask me and others and get outraged by it. Like I said, I mean, he plays it like a violin and everybody falls right into it. But that's not a real request.
Let's take a look at this. Meantime, in the Washington Post, genuinely horrified. That's the way the Post is describing the reaction of some White House officials to President Trump's calls with world leaders. And according to the Post, their concerns go back to the very beginning of the administration. Joining us now to discuss is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, Michael Fuchs. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. First, I just want to get your response to that headline that White House officials were genuinely horrified at conversations that Trump had with world leaders.
Well, I think that headline really sums up what we've frankly known to be the case for the last 2.5 years. We've seen reports repeatedly since President Trump became president of just how inappropriate he has been in conversations with world leaders really from day one. And I think that what we're learning really over the last 10 days to 2 weeks or so is just how bad those conversations really are. The Ukraine scandal obviously being the best example of that, in which he's trying to extort a foreign country partner of ours in order to dig up dirt, create dirt on his political opponent. But we're also learning that obviously extends beyond that to China as well. We're seeing that he is very clearly willing to throw under the bus the people of Hong Kong in order to get some potentially trade concessions, and also calling on China again to investigate and create dirt on his political opponents. And so I think what we're seeing now is everyone sort of come out and express these concerns that frankly have been there for 2.5 years now.
You know, recently you wrote that President Trump is transforming the United States into a mafia state with him as the de facto godfather, and that for the sake of national security, he must be held accountable. But I'm wondering how you see that happening, because even if Democrats impeach him, the Senate with a Republican majority, they're not likely to convict him.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not going to handicap, obviously, what would happen in the Senate right now if the House were to actually impeach the president. But very clearly, from my perspective as a national security professional and someone who spent years working in the State Department, this is a sad moment, frankly, for our democracy and, frankly, for our national security. What we see the president doing right now is putting the interests of the United States and the American people at risk to advance his own personal interests. That clip you played of Senator Marco Rubio there just a moment ago, I think, puts it in very stark terms for us right now. That right there is a conservative U.S. senator who is one of the foremost hawks, as they call them, on China. He thinks we need to get tough on China every which way. But then when confronted with evidence on camera of the President of the United States asking the leader of China to help him in his own reelection campaign here, the senator has nothing to say but to try to dismiss it as a joke. And so again, I think what we're seeing here right now is a question that needs to be put to every single United States senator in a vote, which is, do you believe that what the president is doing right now is in the best interests of the United States, our democracy, and our national security, or not?
Yeah, Rubio effectively suggested that Trump was just trolling the media. I'm also glad you mentioned your previous experience at the State Department, because I wanted to get your perspective on Secretary of State Mike Pompeo not only refusing to comply with these congressional subpoenas, but also just accusing Democrats of intimidation.
Well, look, it's a little bit rich to hear Secretary Pompeo accuse Democrats of intimidation when, when he was a House member, he did far, far worse in bringing up conspiracy theories and going after professional diplomats when he was on the Benghazi committee. Also, his own Inspector General has leveled accusations against his State Department for intimidating career professionals at the State Department right now. But I think what you see, frankly, is Secretary of State Pompeo running a little bit scared. He realizes how he is neck deep mired in this scandal right now. Those text messages that came out the other day between the ambassadors dealing with Ukraine right now very clearly said when the ambassador, our charge in Ukraine, raised concerns about what is happening in trying to extort the Ukrainian government, the EU, our ambassador to the EU, Mr. Ambassador Sondland, actually said, if you have any problems with that, why don't you call Secretary Pompeo? S is the acronym that they use in that text message there. So clearly Pompeo is implicated in all of this, and he's doing whatever he can to resist more information coming out.
Yeah, Pompeo was actually in Greece this morning, and he again repeated the line that everything in the communications between President Trump and his administration